It's wonderful to see all of you trickle back into our little Zoom auditorium once again. I'm Anuj Shah, and I'll be co-moderating this event with Divyan Saxena. Now, on behalf of the whole Speaker Series India at Berkeley team, we're thankful for your consistent support over the last year. To all our friends joining in from different parts of the world, a very warm welcome, and thank you for really engaging with the stories we bring to you. To everyone joining in from India, we can provide you with an hour of respite and optimism despite the grim reality our country is currently facing. We wish you all the strength and want to take a minute to acknowledge India's current COVID situation.
Everyone over here knows that India is grappling with the brutal second wave of COVID-19, and the availability of oxygen tankers and concentrators has become a public health emergency. At SSIB, it pains us when we hear devastating stories of hospitals running out of oxygen supply, and we feel helpless here, sitting in the United States. As a responsible Indian organization on the Berkeley campus, we believe it is our duty to gather the Indian community at Berkeley in a bid to help India in its fight. We need to pool our resources together and solve this critical problem of oxygen supply. For this reason, we have partnered with the Association of American Physicians of Indian Origin, AAPI, the Indian Embassy, and other Indian organizations across the United States, working in partnership with the North American Association of Indian Students, NAAIS, to help address this issue. We are hoping to raise $10,000 to ensure that 20 oxygen containers servicing 4 people each can be directly sent to government hospitals in India. The shipment of containers is scheduled to leave in a week, thus taking timely action is extremely important. Every small contribution counts, so please consider donating to this initiative and make sure we stand with our fellow Indians in these difficult times. I'll be sending our fundraiser link on the chat and hope everyone can contribute to this initiative. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Shubham. So let's get started because we have a lot to cover. So in the past, Speaker Series India at Berkeley has invited individuals who have seriously impacted and shaped the thoughts of modern Indian society through their activism and their creations. Today, we have with us another individual who follows this exact same ethos with his pioneering work. Today's event is co-sponsored by Net Worth, an organization from IIM Bangalore. Now, Nandan Nilekani's impact on India and its 1.4 billion citizens has most famously been through two main vehicles: his construction of Infosys, one of India's largest IT powerhouses, and his creation of the Aadhar biometric system. Yet his sphere of influence extends way beyond just those two. Aadhar, GST, UPI, FASTag. If your life has been simplified or time has been saved through any of these innovations, now you know the common thread. So, sir, thank you for joining us today. We're super excited to have you here.
Thank you, Anuj, and I appreciate your deep concern of what's happening in India at the moment. I'm right now in Bangalore, which is going through a 2-week lockdown, and we hope and pray that we will be able to get out of this in the next few weeks.
We hope the same here. So, let's get started. Now, while researching while researching for this event, I saw a lot of interviews, and I had to gain for myself what distinguishes you from the rest of our speakers for me. Now, what that was your resilience in building population scale solutions for India. Now take the list of achievements on your Wikipedia page, for example. It's basically an outright negation of all the armchair critics out there that have titled India as the red tape capital of the world. From starting a company in a pre-liberalized India that ends up becoming one of India's largest private employers, to sticking through different political regimes just in order to get your innovations through to the common man. So, sir, I'd like to start off from the beginning. Where does this resilience come from? Tell us about some episodes from your early life that you think make you who you are today.
Well, I think it's a great observation, Anuj, and I think my resilience, or whatever you want to call it, comes from my childhood and background. I was born in Bangalore. I lived there for the first 12 years of my life. And then my father had a job in the textile industry, which went through a lot of challenges in the 60s. And therefore, after being in a very stable and comfortable situation, he had to move around different jobs in small towns, and he felt that it would be, difficult for my schooling to move to different states and all that. So I went to stay with my uncle, a wonderful man in Dharwad, in 1967. And so at an early age, I was away from my parents, and I learned to manage on my own. I had a wonderful, support from my uncle and my cousins, and my aunt and my cousins. So I learned how to manage. I had to change schools several times. I went from Bangalore, which was a big city, to Dharwad, which is a small university town. So, I think when you deal with all this, you learn to cope with changes in your life. So I guess that gave me my, whatever you want to call it, resilience.
Right. So I think a lot of Indians dream of studying at the IITs, and you did get the privilege of pursuing an education at IIT Bombay. So tell us about that. How did IIT Bombay shape your life? What type of student did you go in as, and what type of student did you come out as?
No, I think IIT Bombay was absolutely seminal in my shaping my life, my attitude, my career, and my sort of skill set. Getting into IIT itself was unusual because in those days, in the 70s, most of the kids in IIT were from big schools in big cities. And they had all the apparatus in those days for appearing for the IIT entrance exam. In those days, the big thing was annual classes and whatnot. And I was really in a small town without any support system. So a bunch of us got together and created our own support system. And I had a number of cousins who were already in IIT who gave me their old, test prep books, hand-me-downs kind of thing. So we sort of worked together, and most of us got into IIT, which was probably the best year for the Harvard in the IIT entrance sweepstakes. So I think that was quite an experience, and for me, IIT was, as I said, transformational experience. I learned my social skills. I learned, of course, in college, but more importantly, I learned my social skills, how to get consensus among people. I took up many responsible positions in the student body and so on, like you guys are doing, and all that helped me to prepare for my life post IIT. So I think that was among the best years of my life, and even today, my best friends from IIT days.
So I picked on one interesting thing that you said is getting consensus among people. Now, while again researching about you, I got the chance of speaking to some of your colleagues and getting some stories about you. And one common thread that they all repeated was this man is able to get different agencies coming from different agencies, private and public, to agree on things that they probably wouldn't have unless someone really capable was telling them to. So what is your that takes me to the next question of what is your leadership style? Like, what do you see yourself? What are your strengths as a leader, and what are your weaknesses as a leader? Probably.
Well, I think, as you mentioned, I am able to bring people of different backgrounds and different skills and different ideologies together for a common purpose. And I've done that both at Infosys as well as in the, my public projects. And that is, basically because I listen and I try to fashion a sort of a minimum viable proposition that everybody agrees to. And I still remember the first time was way back in IIT, and I was one of the organizers of something called Mood Indigo, which is a very famous festival that IIT Bombay used to have. And that was a year there was also a big cyclone, I think, on the eastern coast of India. And there was a lot of people said we should not have Mood Indigo when there's a cyclone and so on. So finally, we struck a Y media, which is we had the event, but we donated the surplus to the cyclone. So that's a way of finding solutions. And I had to do the same at government when I had to bring together a team of very talented people, but some of them were from government that worked for 30 years, and some of them were from techies from elsewhere, and I had to sort of blend this crowd together. So that consensus building has been part of it. I think my weakness for a long time was I was non-confrontational, and I would avoid conflict and avoid confrontation, which meant that I often didn't take the hard decisions required. But that changed after I went to government, because when I dealt in the government, I had to navigate Aadhar project through very, very complex scenario of multiple political parties, different ideologies, bureaucrats, parliamentarians, judicial system activists, journalists, techies, business guys. So, there I learned how to become, so it sort of stiffened me up. So I think that was something which helped me to become much stronger as a leader. And therefore, I think the fact that I had a long stint in the private sector, which built one set of muscles, so to speak, and a 5-year stint in government helped me to round off my abilities to some extent.
Right. So before we jump to Aadhar, obviously a significant part of your life was building Infosys, right? You guys started this company in a non-liberalized India, which a lot of us over here, we probably weren't. Right. So tell us about that. How how was starting a company in a non-liberalized India? Was that normal?
Well, the credit for starting Infosys should really go to Mr. Narayan Murthy, who was our chairman for a very, very long time. He was the principal founder. He was our boss when we all worked together, and it was his idea. And we were all young guys. I was just 25, 26. So, I was quite bindas, as they say. So I sort of joined Mr. Murthy along with other colleagues. So under his leadership, Infosys was started, and it was a very different company because our goal was to create a very professional, technology-intensive company at that time, pre-liberalization India. And
Right.
it took us a long time, and we began in 81, and 81 to 91 was still a difficult era when it was difficult to do any business. But fortunately, in 91, India's economic reforms began in full earnest, and the technology made it possible because the first Earth station came to Bangalore thanks to the vision of Texas Instruments. And they showed us that software development could be globalized. And then there was no looking back. And then we went public, raised money, built campuses, invested in sales and marketing.
Yeah.
And the 90s was a period of rapid growth for Infosys.
All right. And is that where you basically trained yourself to build tech at scale? Tell us about that. Like what experiences at Infosys helped you in the next stint?
Well, I think Infosys helped definitely in thinking scale, though not population scale. Still, it was still corporate scale. But in the early 90s, Infosys was a very small company, and we were just a few $1 million in revenue. And then we set our sights to reach $1 billion in revenue, which at that time looked like a humongous task. And we were able to that unlocked our minds because we had to think scale. How do you get to $1 billion? What does it mean in terms of money, people, markets, brand, so on? So my first experience with scale was at Infosys, from going from a very small company to a multi-billion-dollar company.
Right.
But that is just one aspect of scale. But from that going to population scale was another leap.
All right. So let's come to that then. The exciting journey that you started with Aadhar in 2009, if I'm not wrong. So for a lot of our audience would know what Aadhar is, but some of us would not know what Aadhar is. So tell us from the creator's perspective, what is Aadhar and why was it important for India back then?
Sure, Anuj, and there's a backstory there which I'll tell you. I had, I'd been on the fringe of government activity for a long time. I'd run a task force in Bangalore called the Bangalore Agenda Task Force. I'd worked on the National Knowledge Commission under the leadership of Sam Pitroda and so on. So I'd been on the fringes of the sort of government stuff. And then, so the people in the system knew about it. And in 2009, in May, the UPA government came back with a renewed majority. They got many more seats. And I got an invitation from Rahul Gandhi to join. And he asked me whether I would be the HRD Minister of India because he wanted to reform the education system. So I said, sure, why not? It sounded like a good deal. And my co-founders, Murthy and others at Infosys, were very kind. And they said, here's the national purpose that you have been given. And why don't you go and join and become the HRD minister? So I said, fine, let's do it. And then, but about a week later, just as about the swearing in was about to start, I got a call from Mr. Gandhi saying that it's off. That whatever the system, whatever, they didn't feel I was the right guy to be the HRD minister. I said, cool, I'll go back to work. So I went back to Infosys and started my corner office overlooking a golf course and continued working. And then a few days later, the Prime Minister called me and said, why don't you come and maybe you can become a member of the Planning Commission? So I said, look, I'm happy to join, but if I join, it has to be for something substantial, something that is, impactful. And I didn't feel the offer was good enough. So I said, let me come back with you some ideas. And, what had happened earlier in 2008, I'd written a book called Imagining India, where I talked about the need for an identity for digital ID for everyone. And government also had taken up a project in 2006. And the fundamental thing was twofold. One was, how do we improve the delivery of benefits to people? Because, when you're giving benefits, India began, increasing its social welfare spending in the year 2000. And so as people start getting pensions and scholarships and all kinds of things, they have to be a good way of reaching it to everybody. So one driver for everybody having a unique digital ID was the improvement in the delivery of benefits. The second thing was India was becoming much more of a migrant country, and more people were moving around. People are going from north to south, east to west, from rural to urban India, as you can see even today. And most of them, in fact, many states, more than half the babies born don't have birth certificates. So they didn't have any proof of ID. And if you lived all your life in the same village, it didn't really matter. But the moment you started moving around, people would ask you, show us your ID, and you could board a train, or you couldn't get a job, or the cops would stop you. And suddenly ID became very important. And having a few 100 million Indians without ID was a serious handicap. So there are two drivers for digital identity. One was to improve the delivery of benefits to millions of Indians. And second was inclusion, which was to get people who didn't have any form of ID into the formal system. So both these drivers led to the government setting up the UIDAI in January of 2009. And then what happened was I came along and said, I'll do this job. So they said, okay, why don't you do this job? And that's how I joined the government as the chairman of the Unique Identification Authority of India in July of 2009. I was a cabinet ranked person, thanks to the generosity of the Prime Minister. And I basically took up this assignment. I was employee number one of a startup inside the government.
Wow. Okay, that sounds exciting. So now, what comprises of the Aadhar technology? What is it?
Well, Aadhar was a very simple idea, which was how do you have a unique ID for every individual? So it was saying that we have a system where a person has only one ID so that they are uniquely identified. That was the idea. Now, what happens in developed countries, including the United States, that unique ID comes from your birth certificate. You get only one birth certificate, right? So, you're born and, the hospital or whatever helps you to get a birth certificate. And in the US, 98% of births are registered at the time of birth. So everybody has a birth certificate. Of course, even in the US, there are nowadays controversy of birth certificate. You remember the whole Obama birth certificate. But at least by and large, 98% people have birth certificates. And that becomes a unique ID. And on that you build, you get your voter registration or you get a driver's license. And what do you do when nobody has half the people don't have birth certificates? And how do you make them unique? And we realized the only way to ensure uniqueness was what we call as biometric deduplication, saying that everybody has a unique biometric signature, and therefore we can ensure that it's unique. And we came to the conclusion that if you had the iris of both the eyes, the fingerprints, and a face photograph, that is unique. And then the challenge was, okay, even if that is unique, how do you make sure that somebody gets only one number? And we did what is called as biometric deduplication, where somebody enrolls their biometrics, and those biometrics are then compared against all the people we have to see if it's a duplicate or if the person has registered under some other name and is trying to get a duplicate. And this biometric deduplication was the heart of the technology. And nobody had done this at this scale before. It had not been done for this purpose before. Most of the users of biometric deduplication, for example, where when you land in the US and they want to check whether you came earlier, it's more like a security surveillance kind of thing. We repurposed that technology for development by using that to uniquely identify people. And it was a massively scalable challenge because if we had 1 million registrations a day and we had 500 million people in the database, then we had to do 500 trillion pattern matching every day to figure out who's a duplicate or not. But that was the heart of the technology which we built. And that has never been done before on the planet. So the largest database at that time was about 100 million. So what we're doing was about 10x that. But we were able to get the technology to work. But the equally large challenge was how to implement and deploy it. Because, how to get 1 billion people enrolled? How do you do it in a country with 36 states and union territories? How do you do it with so many languages? How do you do it with so much of illiteracy? How do you do it in every village, in the forest, in Naxal regions, in the mountains?
Right.
So that required a very sophisticated enrollment system, which we built, and we created an ecosystem of enrollment agencies who went out in the boondocks took their devices with them and enrolled people. And everybody had the same technology. So the technology enforced quality of enrollment. So everybody had a PC with the software given by the UIDAI.
Yeah.
And this system was designed for 1.5 million enrollments a day.
A day.
So of that scale, we were able to get to about 600 million Aadhars issued by March 2014, at which point I said, I declared my success and stepped down.
And today that number is 1.3 billion?
Yeah, I think it's about 1.27 billion or thereabouts.
Wow. That is super impressive. And just the numbers, I feel like we need to stress to our audience that talking in billions is a different ballgame altogether. Where
so we had to build a system that was scalable at the back end through technology and scalable at the front end through architecture of enrollment. And it's very important to understand why, because we did a system which was pro citizen, in the sense you could choose where and when you enroll. So normally, if you have these systems, they say you come at 4 o'clock on Saturday afternoon here, and then only you can do it and all that. We said, no, let's open it up and make it anytime, anywhere. So for example, you could have somebody from Jharkhand who was working in Gurgaon, and they could come on an afternoon and register themselves. So we made it very pro people in that sense. And because the technology could ensure that people didn't have duplicate numbers. So we use technology at scale at the back end, and we use enrollment at scale at the front end. So architecture of scalability is very important. So a lot of the thought went into that. And all that was done in the early days. In fact, I joined in July of 2009, and by August, we already had a broad strategy paper, which we took to the cabinet. And that still is valid,
right.
12, 13 years later, if you go back and look at the document, it's still valid. So, thinking through these things is very important upfront.
So this was the scalability of this technology was something that had not been done in the world before towards this purpose. So
yeah, the largest database was over 100 million. Ours was a billion, so it was 10x in terms of scale.
Right. So Aadhar is done in 2014. You've got your 600 million subscribers. It's rapidly growing also then, and then I feel you start developing a lot more innovations on top of Aadhar. So what innovations benefited from the existence of a unique identity, and how did the India stack form?
Well, some of the innovations were actually done while I was in UIDAI in 2014, and subsequently, many of the innovations were done by people in the system, including my dear friend Ram Sevak Sharma, who is also a graduate of the UC system.
Right.
He went to UC Riverside to do his master's in computer science in his 40s with his wife and kids in tow and on a bike. So he's quite a remarkable guy. Today, he's actually leading the COVID vaccination drive. And in between, he was the chairman of TRAI. So Ram Sevak was also secretary IT after his stint at UIDAI. And many of the other things in the India stack, like digital signatures, digital lockers, which is like giving every Indian his own private cloud in some sense, his own cloud space. All that was done by Ram Sevak and along with Dr. Pramod Verma, who was the chief architect of Aadhar and then worked on these platforms. And then sometime in 2013, is what had happened during Aadhar days is we also built the world's largest direct benefit transfer system. So we connected Aadhar to the banking system, and today we have 700 million Aadhar-linked bank accounts, and can transfer money in real time to anyone's bank account, which was very useful in the pandemic. So unlike in many countries where people were mailing checks which took several months to reach the beneficiaries, in India, you can do real-time credit into bank accounts at population scale. So a few 100 million people can get money into the bank account in real time. So that's the most advanced sort of DBT in the world, direct benefit transfer. So that was done in the UIDAI days. But later on, I became an advisor to NPCI for innovation and public policy. And Dilip Asbe, the current CEO, Pramod, and myself sort of thought through the whole idea of having a next generation payment system for mobile, anytime, anywhere, and so on. And that led to the UPI, which was launched in May of 2016. And in October of 2016, it was doing only 100,000 transactions a day. And then demonetization came on, and the government saw the value of digital payments and last month they did 2.7 billion transactions a day, where people use their mobile phones, or people can buy at a vegetable vendor or buy a coconut to drink water or whatever. So it's really democratized payments. It's the world's very high volume, low cost payment system, which is very unique. And it's designed now for 1 billion transactions a day. So so all these things happened over the last 10 years. The Aadhar led to DBT, then the digital signatures, digital lockers, and so on, UPI, and so on. So, I mean, there are many other things, but these are the big things that happened between 2009 and say 2016, 2017.
I'd just like to conclude this section with by telling our audience that Sir is very loosely using numbers like 100 million, 200 million, and 1.4 billion and stuff like that. But these are massive numbers that are not seen in other countries, other developed countries of the world, maybe China. But he can tell us more about where China and India, what's the relation between China and India with respect to these technological advancements.
Well, I think Chinese do have an ID system. I don't know exactly how it works, but a lot of the Chinese, for example, innovation in payments happened in the private sector because they really gave full freedom to internet companies to offer digital payments, and we have seen the rise of phenomenal companies like Alipay, which is part of Alibaba, and WeChat, which is part of Tencent. But as you know, today in China, there seems to be, I mean, there's all based on hearsay, there seems to be a rethink on the role of these large private companies, and the Chinese regulators are bringing in more constraints on what they can do. In India, this issue was thought through right in the beginning, and the architecture of our ID system is completely opened up. Multiple people can use it. At the same time, these IDs cannot be used to collect data. So our Aadhar system does not collect data, which is a very important design principle, that we didn't want it to be a data collecting machinery. We just wanted it to be an ID verification machinery. So the ID system is very simple, has very simple data, and no data is accumulated by Aadhar. So it's all federated so that you don't have these aggregations of data. And even the UPI system is designed for innovation. There are multiple banks, more than 100 banks participate, and there are multiple front-end applications. So you can make a payment through Google Pay, WhatsApp Pay, Amazon Pay, Paytm, Phone Pay, all that. So it's a very competitive, open payment system where there's a common payment rail provided by a non-profit like NPCI, which is the heart of creating public goods. So I think broadly this comes into what we call as digital public goods. Right. If you think about it, the original internet and the original GPS were digital public goods paid for by the US state, and later on they were opened up for the private markets. So we are creating a new class of digital public goods, which are much more designed towards billion scale people who have no phones, people who are illiterate. So it's a whole new architecture for digital public goods.
Right.
Absolutely, yeah. So just to carry this on, this thought forward. Now that all this tech at scale has been built, India's tech has been germinating for the last decade. How do we plug this into our current situation? The current reality that India is facing. How do we plug all of this tech and use it to the absolute benefit of right now?
Well, very much. As I said, India has built the world's largest real-time direct cash transfer system. Mm-hmm. And this was very handy in the first phase of the pandemic last year when the government gave emergency payments to a few hundred million people, and they were able to directly credit it into their bank accounts. So it was very useful in that. And in the current round, Aadhar, for example, is very useful for vaccination and testing. So people, when they get vaccinated, they get a digital vaccination certificate. Across the country, they get the same certificate. It's a portable certificate. So, for example, I can take my first dose of vaccine in location X in this state, and I can take my second dose in another state, and it's all connected on the system. And the vaccination certificate is completely digital. You can store it in your smartphone. You can store it. You can take a printout and show it to somebody, or you can store it on the DigiLocker, which is another part of the architecture that we have. And it's digitally signed and encrypted, so you can't fake these certificates. And it has a QR code for authentication. So this is a very advanced model of verifiable credentials, which no other country has implemented. So I think all these are byproducts of the infrastructure we created. There were other things that we did. I mean, I was involved with the original design of the GST system, where India took the tax system, which was, different state VAT taxes was all combined into one national GST. That was a major reform the government did, and I was involved in the design of the company and the architecture for that. I was also led the panel for designing the fast tag system, which is really to smoothen the productivity of traffic on the roads, where you have a truck going through a toll gate just automatically debit your bank account in real time. Now that in the US does has easy pass, but in the US they are all at the state level. So if you go from New Jersey to Ohio, you'll have a different system. In India, we have one system for the country. So a truck can start in Calcutta and come to Trivandrum, and it can use the same ID system. So a whole host of things like that. Our general philosophy is how do you improve inclusion at population scale? How do you improve productivity at population scale? And how do you transform the lives of people using technology for good?
Absolutely. So, sir, on that note, we thought a really interesting question to ask you would be, what are some interesting use cases of the Aadhar system that you would implement given absolutely no constraint of resources, right? We wanted to see what you think are potentially 3 big ideas that could be implemented if we had the resources.
No, I don't see any challenge. I mean, today, for example, India does billions of eKYCs. eKYC is electronic know your customer. So you can open a bank account in 2 minutes. You can buy a mutual fund in 2 minutes. Again, this was very useful in the pandemic because now I can sit in my home with my phone and open a bank account without having to meet anybody. So in a pandemic, when we were talking about social distancing and all that, the ability to access digital services online without going anywhere or meeting anyone, it became very useful. Recently, for example, the government said that you could renew your driver's license without leaving your house by doing an Aadhar authentication online. So all these are technologies that essentially helped in the pandemic to get things done without meeting anyone, and all electronically and with full authentication and full verification. So I think I think that all the ideas are there, and what I find is that different people are using it in different ways as they see the power. I don't think it's a resource issue. It's not about spending more money. It's about people understanding the power of a technology. It's a general purpose technology, right? So in the sense that it can be for multiple use cases. So as and when people discover new things, they are able to use it.
Absolutely. So I think to just switch gears, a little bit, I had specifically told Anuj that I wanted to talk to you about the future of decentralization and crypto in India. So my first question on that end is, you expressed your views on how India could become a 5 trillion economy by the adoption of digital currencies that would unlock previously untapped capital pools. But it often becomes a task to convince people of its potential. When looking at the way it's been handled by, for example, China's digital yuan. So where do you see the future of the monetary regime in India going? Do you think there is genuinely scope for a truly decentralized means of exchange? Or do you think it'll be a nightmare for the government to give up the reins, in that sense?
Oh, I think there are many aspects to this. There is first the aspect of digital currencies, and whether it's Bitcoin or Ethereum or whatever it is. Now, these are, at least I don't see them as transactional currencies in the sense, because of the nature of the design of the Bitcoin and others on a distributed ledger, I doubt whether they can scale up to the volumes we have. And they also have very high transaction costs. So when you have a low capacity, high transaction cost system, you can't really use it for day-to-day payments. For that, something like UPI is much superior because, as I said, UPI is designed for 1 billion small value transactions a day. and at very low cost. So, so I think these are not transactional systems in my view, and I think other people agree. I think I see it more as an asset class where, you can keep your, you keep your money in gold or wine futures, or you can have Bitcoin or whatever you want. So those are more like asset classes which you diversify. So it is in that context that I think if India is able to allow these as asset classes, then it becomes one more way to keep your savings, just like you keep it in gold. But also because globally the value in these currencies is, say, in excess of $1 trillion, then that capital also becomes available to the country for its small businesses. So that is where I come from. There's another issue, which is stable coins. Stable coins are essentially currencies which are on the back of an existing fiat currency. So the stable coin on the dollar will be there or so on. Now, and stable coins can either be private sector stable coins, or they can be government stable coins, what are called as central bank digital currencies. And that's what is happening in China, for example. You have the digital yuan, which is a CBDC. Now, they're not, I mean, they may use ledgers, but they not necessarily have the anonymization value of Bitcoin, because if the central government is doing the ledger, then they can also keep track of who's on the ledger. So I think it's possible that you may have an Indian digital rupee, which is a central bank digital currency, which can be offered. But a lot of the response of CBDC is because the current payment systems in many of these countries are a high cost or whatever. In India, we don't have the problem because we already have a very sophisticated payment system, which is very high volume, low cost. So you have to think carefully about what is the role of these things. So broadly, I would say cryptocurrencies as asset class, not as a transactional system, and maybe a CBDC from the central government, which is a complement to the existing payment system and interacting with it.
Right. Yeah. So that makes a lot of sense, and it is in line with a lot of what we've read about you and your thoughts. So a quick follow up on that would be, so you just expressed how crypto in its current form and shape can't replace fiat currency, which is our legal tender, right? However, one could argue that there are welfare benefits of a crypto based system or a, say, digital rupee based system, in that it would limit, if not eliminate, bad actors in the system, right? So could you tell us a little more about how UPI or our current system could be changed to make sure that this happens?
No, I mean, there's no particular evidence that crypto will eliminate bad actors. I don't buy that argument. In fact, a lot of the crypto is for bad reasons. So it's not clear to me that there's some great thing happening there. But I think, in the case of UPI, obviously, it's a more traditional architecture, which is a transaction processing system with a centralized provider like NPCI and regulated by the central regulator. And they have their own checks and balances on, KYC and all these things to prevent, so there's no particular evidence that crypto is going to change that, by the way. So I don't know where you got that from.
Yeah, so no, that's just a viewpoint that I've heard circulating across the world, honestly. So I thought that's something interesting that I would talk to you about. In terms of our next question, right, what would you say are the sunrise sectors for India in the next 10, 15, 20 years? Where do you think we could go, and what do you hope to see out of our generation?
Well, I think the structural thing is India is the only young country in an overall aging world. I think China is already aging quite rapidly because of the one-child policy, and India will be the only young country in an aging world, and it's going to have young people for at least next 15, 20 years. Now, Africa, of course, is going to be young for a very long time, but Africa is 54 countries, whereas we have one country with 1 billion population that is young. And therefore, I think it will be a magnet for capital, jobs. So key thing is getting our internal reforms in place to create job creating growth, which allows all these young people to participate in the economy. And India has the potential, if we get all this right, to grow at 5-6% for the next 20 years. which in turn will help to eliminate many of the challenges we have of poverty and so on. And it has to be job creating growth. So that's a key point, that you have to do it in a way that millions of people get jobs. And I think many of the infrastructure that we have created will actually help in that. For example, another big part of the work we have done is what's called as the data empowerment architecture, where India is the only country in the world where people can leverage their own data. So unlike in the West or elsewhere where data is either accumulated by governments or large companies, in India, individuals and businesses can use the data for themselves. And this is a very unique architecture which is not there anywhere else. And it's being applied now in the credit sector, where millions of small businesses can use their own data to get access to credit. So if you can do that, then we'll create the economy where millions of businesses will create jobs. And I think if 10 million businesses create 2 jobs each, that's 20 million jobs. So I think that's a big part of that. So there are many other things. I mean, I think education is going to happen now at scale. Health sector, especially after the pandemic and the COVID situation, the need for having state-of-the-art health technology and health sector is very important. So there are many, many sectors which I think will do well in the coming years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. One absolute last question before we move on to the audience Q&A is you just spoke about how creating jobs is the absolute key requirement for the next couple of years, and also you spoke about how small businesses are taking advantage of a lot of the digital transformations that are happening in India. Could you tell us a little more about the Beacon API and how the unbundling of digital commerce could lead to more inclusivity, could lead to more opportunity?
Yeah, so the Beacon API is a non-profit again set up by Pramod, myself, and Sujit Nair, who's the CEO. And the idea is that how do we unbundle things like commerce and mobility? Because today you have monolithic providers who essentially accumulate all the data and so on. So if you can open it up, then many, many small businesses can participate. Many small delivery guys can participate. In mobility, I can combine mass transit with car ride hailing. So I can take a car and go to the BART and take the BART or whatever. And those things can all be done seamlessly. So I think Beacon is an attempt to unbundle things. And we learned about unbundling from our UPI experience, that if you unbundle and create common rails, you can have an explosion of innovation. And there's another big area where I'm involved with. One is in AI. And we have done EkStep, which is the foundation that I head, has done a lot of work in machine translation. And the Indian Supreme Court, as well as recently the Bangladesh Supreme Court, is using this AI tools for translating judgments and witness documents in 9 Indian languages. Of course, in Bangladesh, they're using it in Bengali. So I see AI as a big use case in India. In the GST system, AI is being used heavily to catch fraud and fake invoices. And then the other big thing is in learning. And EkStep does a whole platform called Sunbird, which is the foundational thing for India's Diksha platform for reaching education to millions of kids. So there's a whole learning initiative. So this platform enables skills, learning, as well as capacity building and so on. So that's another piece of some of the stuff we have done. All of it at population scale.
Mm-hmm.
All right, now let's quickly move to audience questions because they're pouring in. So our first question, we would have loved to do it live so that our audience could ask it, but we're short of time. So we're going to just relay the questions from the audience. Our first question is from Jennifer Bussell, who's a professor at UC Berkeley itself. So her question is, what do you see as the next major opportunity at the intersection of technology, governance, and social welfare?
Sure. I know Jennifer, she's come to my home in Bangalore 10 years back or something. So I know her quite well. She was at Yale earlier. So anyway, so I think, I think what we have learned from all these initiatives is that if you use technology well, you can do it at scale, but it has to be inclusive. So clearly, financial services was the first area where we were able to bring together technology, people, and get scale benefits. But I think education is now poised for that. And we believe that with things like the Diksha platform, we can reach millions of kids and teachers and put the best content at their fingertips. A very important part of designing for inclusion is ensuring that all categories of people can have access, because one of the problems with digital platforms is then you're sort of bound by whether you have access or not. So, if all your learning is online, then those who don't have devices can't learn. So we have done a lot of thinking about how to deliver stuff for people who have phones and people who don't have phones. So
Right.
that a billion people. So that's an important design principle in everything we do. For example, in payments, you can do UPI payments on your smartphone. You can do UPI payments on your feature phone also. And for people who don't have any device, they can use their Aadhar and open a bank account and do a payment using the Aadhar-enabled payment system without any device. So all our effort is how do we make sure we have inclusion. So I think financial services, education, healthcare, skills, livelihoods, these are the places where I see the intersection of all these things.
Right.
Thanks, Nandan. It's great to see you, and I really appreciate that follow-up.
Sure, Jennifer.
So our next question is from Shabam Parekh, who's a member of our organization. His question is, what's your view on demonizing entrepreneurship in India? Recently, we've seen Aadhar Poonawalla is facing the brunt of it because of the vaccines, being priced differently. How do you think the government should act in mitigating these perceptions and promoting entrepreneurship in India? This holds weight since you and others like Mr. Murthy and Tata are considered as entrepreneurial, role models for a majority of this country.
Well, I think, India has come a long way in terms of recognizing the role of entrepreneurs. And I think certainly the last 30 odd years since economic reforms, we have seen a big growth in entrepreneurs. So I think it's there. But I also think entrepreneurs also have a responsibility of conducting their business well. I mean, people have talked about stigmatized capitalism because many entrepreneurs have, cheated the system, taken money out, and so on. So I think it's a two-way street. Entrepreneurs have to conduct themselves in ethical manner, and the state has to recognize entrepreneurs as a critical cog in the entire machine of the country. So it works both ways, and sometimes it goes this way, sometimes it goes that way.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Our next question, I haven't got the name of the person who's asked the question, but it's a great question, so I'm still going to ask it. What are your views on a higher representation of scientists and technologists in politics, particularly in decision-making positions? Do you have a roadmap to make that vision a reality?
Well, I think, finally, politics is the people's choice. So I think people have to choose their representatives, and we cannot say there should be so many doctors or so many engineers or whatever. So I think it's up to the people to decide. And over time, as you have a more educated electorate, as well as more educated people entering politics, that will change. It's not necessary, I think we just have, these are social change issues, and can't be done through diktat. But I think by and large, I think the government is open to ideas from outside and is willing to listen to experts, which is the important thing.
All right. Thank you.
So our next question is, I believe, from Anupam Saraf. So he sent a couple of questions, but I think something that's very in line with what we've been talking about is, does the UIDAI lack skin in the game, as it takes no responsibility for either identification or the delivery of service based on the identification?
No, I think the UIDAI is an excellent example of how India has created a public good. It was built at speed and scale in a very short time. It has very high, performance levels and very high commitment to on-time performance and accuracy and so on. So I think it's doing a great job.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with also how it's being used right now. So I think if we look at how well it's responding to the pandemic, right, we really see all the benefits that you were able to envision 12 years ago, right? So I absolutely agree. Anuj, do you want to ask the next question?
Yeah. A question from Jeet Shah is, what problems do you think the coronavirus has made apparent?
Well, I think first of all, we have seen at least right now we are seeing the impact of that on our health infrastructure, and that if there is a very rapid growth of cases, then it can overwhelm the health infrastructure, whether it's hospitals, beds, ICU units, oxygen concentrators, or cemeteries. So clearly, it has exposed that we really need a much deeper health infrastructure, both in the public and the private sector for India. The second thing, it has laid bare the difference in the economic sort of impact on people whose jobs can be done over wireline or wireless, and those whose jobs are in proximity. So this is so-called K-shaped recovery, where companies in technology and finance, which can deliver service from home, have done really well. But organizations like airlines, hotels, restaurants, which involve people contact, have suffered badly. So I think the digital divide, in the sense of jobs that have proximity and contact and jobs that don't have proximity and contact, I think that has become very apparent. And we really need to think through how we make a more equitable economic structure where both types of jobs can function.
Right. So that digital divide has also made the economic divide more severe, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You're seeing the massive job loss in tourism, hotels, restaurants, airlines. And on the other hand, technology companies that can work from home are doing well. So it's clearly a gap.
So another very interesting question we received from I think Pratyush Singh is, so in two interviews, one I think where you were interviewed by Shoma Chaudhary, he read that the first line of the description was tech, data, and AI are the new electricity in India. And another one by I believe the Financial Times was how there's Facebook, Google, Tesla, in the valley, but not in India. So just to bring these two diverse perspectives together, why do we need all this new technology when a lot of the country still doesn't have electricity? What is your view on building for a more equitable India, as you just talked about?
Well, I think, first of all, I don't think we should knock the progress in India. I think, the different environments create different types of companies. So, it's not that they have to be the same as what happened elsewhere. I mean, India today, for example, has a $190 billion technology industry, which creates millions of jobs and delivers and keeps the world, supports the world. So I think that's a very important, achievement. I think electricity can happen in parallel. It's not that you wait for electricity and then you do technology. In fact, in many ways, the technology is helping electricity. For example, one of the proposals is to do direct. One of the reasons for our electricity networks is subsidies and theft of power, which makes our distribution companies weak. And one way to solve that is by actually having DBT for electricity, where we give cash transfers to people who need electricity, but they all buy it at the same price from the grid, which is what was done to reform the hydrocarbon sector. And today the hydrocarbon sector is essentially free of subsidies, because those who need to get subsidy get it as a DBT. So you can do the same in electricity. So I think, in fact, technology can play a big role. And the other part is to deal with energy transition. As we go from more central coal and gas-fired plants to millions of renewable points that feed back into the grid, you can only manage that with technology. So I think that there's not a this or that kind of debate here.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So one question by Pradeep Revan was a belief that I feel is in the subconscious of a lot of us here in the audience is people who are. I'll let you answer that. So his statement is, government is very slow in decision making or in responding to new tech innovation. How do you deal with such government bureaucrats?
No, I think in general, and it's not an India specific thing, the pace of innovation in every sector generally is far ahead of the ability of a regulatory system to respond to that. I mean, the whole global financial crisis was essentially innovation going ahead of regulation. So I think this is a issue everywhere, and we have to find ways to deal with that, because innovation happens very fast. A bunch of guys can do it, but regulation takes time. There's you to find consensus. So they're different, operate at different speeds.
Divyansh, do you have one? Because even I've chosen one more. So I have a
Yeah. So
okay,
go for it. Go for it. No,
All right.
go for it.
So I have a question by Gautami. Her question is about the data empowerment architecture program that I've heard you talk about a lot recently. So is this only meant for businesses? First, what is it? Is it only meant for businesses, or will it be available for private citizens also?
No, the data empowered architecture is a very fundamental redesign of how data is going to be used in the 21st century. We have realized that data is so critical, and that holding data is very important. And as we become more digital, there's going to be more digital footprints that people will leave behind.
Yeah.
What data empowerment architecture does is it puts the data in the hands of the people or the small businesses. This is a very fundamental shift, and it takes time for people to understand this inversion of data from being accumulated by a few to being accessible to all.
Right.
And therefore, this is what we call as data democratization, which will allow individuals and businesses to use their own data to improve their lives. So a small business can use its own data to get better credit. An individual can use his healthcare records to get better healthcare. A person who has various skills can use his skill records to get a better job. And therefore, this whole putting data in the hands of users, individuals, for private, for public purpose, is a very, very fundamental transition. And India will do it at population scale, because 1 billion people will be able to use their own data. So I think it's a very, very significant architectural change to the world of data.
And this is not only in India, but globally, right?
No, this can be used by anyone, but I think in terms of the ideas, the most advanced implementation of that is in India, and any country can implement the data empowerment architecture. It requires technology, it requires processes, it requires regulations and laws. So all of that has to come together.
So, sir, I know we're almost out of time. So just to sort of like a last question. A lot of our audience is, students from both India and the US. So as a last question, we wanted to get 3 book recommendations from you, and also 3 big ideas that we should be thinking about as we progress into the workforce, as we start doing things of our own.
Well, I think there's a very good book on Tesla, the inventor, and how he invented so many things. He was a contemporary of Edison, and he invented many things, which ultimately, the car company took his name from Tesla. So there's a very good book on Tesla. I think the book on Dadabhai Nauroji, who was an early independence leader of India, by Dinshok Patel, I think that's a very good book to get a sense of the history of early India. And I think Gopal Krishna Gandhi's new book on the young Gandhi is also very good.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And in terms of 3 big ideas that you think we should be thinking about as we move into the workforce?
Well, I think certainly data empowerment is a big idea which you should think about. I think continuous lifetime learning is another big idea. You'll have to, today the world requires us to be on top of things all the time. So continuous learning is a big idea, and being very flexible and collaborative is very important.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's a very big idea to be thinking about, because as we did this event, I can't tell you how much collaboration was required. But I think just to conclude, I'd like to thank first of all, I'd like to thank Mr. Nilekani for taking the time out of his extremely busy schedule. He was super responsive to our emails and very, very active in the entire process. So we'd like to thank you for joining us and providing us with such incredible insights. I'm certain there's an entire treasure trove of ideas that people have been able to take away. We'd like to thank our co-sponsors, Networth from IIM Bangalore. We'd like to thank our marketing partners, Asha for Education, Berkeley Business Society, and the Institute for South Asian Studies at Berkeley. And as always, A huge thank you to the audience for attending from across the world. Be sure to donate to our COVID fundraiser in partnership with the North American Association of Indian Students. And of course, follow us on Instagram for future events, follow our YouTube channel to view the recordings of each of our events. And once again, thank you, Mr. Nilekani, for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, and please stay safe in these times.
You too, sir.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.